and that this would ultimately lead to a question mark on their separate identity. Now, the idea of identity is inherent in our constitution. When we talk about the fundamental rights, minority rights, Article 29, Article 30, when we talk of cultural rights, language, etc. Now, is religion part of culture, or is religion something from culture, is a question that we'll have to decide one day. And I think there was an attempt recently in the Supreme Court in the matters of election law, that where Chief Justice Varma's judgment about Hindutva being a way of life rather than religion, and if it's a way of life, could it be interfered with in election law on grounds of religion, etc.? And he had given a particular judgment, as you know. There was an attempt to review that judgment, and everybody assumed that the judgment would be reviewed, but the court hasn't accepted that. And the court said, no, we are just reviewing something else, not this whole thing about what is Hindutva, or what is the Panth, and so on and so forth. So there are many issues there that one day the court will have to decide as to where does culture stop and where does religion begin. Are they two overlapping, or are they two intrinsically linked? So because of that and the protection that the Constitution gives to minority identity, this wasn't taken up. And of course the BJP feels that the Congress did it because the Congress was not firm enough in its understanding and its commitment to secularism, and therefore it made concessions to minorities, often described as appeasement, and therefore when they come to power, they obviously have to then put their money where their mouth is and say, we've got to bring in these changes. Now, there can be arguments about appeasement and counter-appeasement, just as there are arguments about reservation and counter-reservation between affirmative action and reverse discrimination, etc. These are all concepts that need further debate and discussion in the country, and not just to be labeled as you're anti and you're for, therefore we can't have a further discussion. I do think that in the BJP's political strategy, as opposed to their ideology is something completely different from political strategy. There's a calculation there, as I believe there have been calculations in the Congress Party's programs in the past. There's a calculation that if you strike at triple talaq, you're actually striking at something that women find oppressive, and women are inclusive of Muslim women. Therefore, 50% of a minority vote will automatically look at us because we've made this effort. Now, that's a calculation they have made. And if it's a calculation that works, good for them. If it doesn't work, there is nothing really there to lose. But I think it's a political calculation that's being made. I think the critical point there, from the point of view of someone who's concerned about women's rights, I think there's a larger question. Is it a concern about giving women something more, or is it, and protection, or is it just a political calculation? Now, one way to assist and help women would have been that any woman who is, and irrespective of religion, who is divorced in circumstances that she doesn't have adequate protection, financially or otherwise, would be assisted through state agencies, and the money would then be recovered from the erstwhile husband. I believe that might have been a straightforward, honest way of helping women rather than going by this convoluted manner.
I'll open it up. Thank you. Questions?
You did speak about the multiple identities that people have and the calculations, so to say, based on those. I was just wondering, so there is clearly an intersectionality of various identities in a person's experience, in how one behaves in society, and how that matters in the bigger picture. So what could be a good enough future? What is the way forward for a brand of politics that kind of respects and is open enough for having that kind of intersectionality on multiple fronts, let's say on caste in India in particular, then of course gender-related politics, and this happens to be one particular policy which is clearly directed to a certain specific section of the electorate. So I was just wondering what is the future for that brand of politics, which is more tolerant and which is more understanding of this idea that India does have these social identities and how they play a role in their intersectionality for a person's experience.
Well, I think that's a very good question. But if I could answer it easily, I would be the most successful politician in India. But I think that's the challenge for any modern day politician in our country. That's the challenge. When you talk of multiple identities or cutting across barriers of various engagements and associations in society, I think it actually goes back to my idea of India. There are people who believe that there is one notion of India and one notion of India. So one nation, one people. Now, I don't think that one can disagree with the essential aspiration that as a nation or a society anywhere, you have to have some intrinsic critical mass of similarity. Otherwise, you're not a society. I mean, why would you be a society if you didn't have certain attributes that were similar and that brought you together? Why would people be Irish or Welsh or English or whatever? But there are some commonalities that keep them together. And that's true about India as well. I mean, we speak different languages, we speak different food, we are part of different regions, we have different priorities in different regions, but something tells us, and it's difficult to describe, but if you ask yourself, am I part of India? And then you say, of course, I am part of India. And then someone says, I'm not part of India because I'm not like you, I'm different, or you say to them, you're different, etc. So they feel alienated and they feel that they're not part of India, and that's where the problems begin. Now, India, as I understand, and I think most of us understand, has always been an inclusive civilization. We have grown and we have been nourished and we flourished with inclusion rather than saying, no, we won't have this, we won't have that. I mean, the Hindu philosophy concept of neti, of rejecting something, etc., is for particular purposes, but for the rest, Hindu philosophy is inclusive, that anybody can come. Nobody can draw a line and say, this is Hindu and everything outside this is Hindu. In fact, that's the critical difference between many of the other religions and Hinduism, is because Hinduism includes many things and many manifestations. And that's reflected in India's, the idea of India, that's reflected in how Mahatma Gandhi saw India, that you could be intensely religious and yet be secular. Unlike the thinking of secularism in Europe, where religion and secularism have to be kept apart. One is about governance and the other one is about religion and spirituality. In India, spirituality and religion, philosophy of religion is part of our daily life. And generally, it's not harmful to anyone. I mean, what you do and how you eat your food doesn't hurt somebody else. They eat their food differently. Or if you eat some kind of food and they eat another kind of food. And of course, sometimes you don't sit in the same place and you're considerate about that. But in many places, you would have a vegetarian take you to a restaurant saying, I get you some best meat here, the best chicken here. And you didn't look at that guy and say, how do you know? How do you know? He said, oh, just believe you me, let's go. And then you end up getting a terrific meal. But I think that's the quality of India that, well, we cherish. And I hope that appropriate education, argumentation, the dissemination of ideas, and group discussions of this kind in different parts of the country and wherever you find Indians and people who are sympathetic to India and Indians can meet and do. And I believe that that's what democracy is about, and democracy will therefore itself evolve and ultimately be endorsed by an electoral verdict.
Can I take up one little point about the sort of the triple talaq? You mentioned khula. I was once present in the Lahore High. I'm from Lahore. So, and Mr. Justice Abdul Qayyum, there was, or the infamous one.
Okay.
And there was this lady who had applied for khula. And after 3 months, her husband was crying in the court that he didn't want to divorce her. He said, but you don't want to divorce her, but she wants to divorce you. And he would not listen to her, and he just asked the lady once, do you want a divorce? She said, yes. And he forced her husband to pay her 3 months' payment and finish the matter. Is that not, there are several cases in Pakistan as far as khula go, where the woman really has very strong rights.
Well, I thank you for that. I mean, if women have such strong rights, why haven't we recognized this? I mean, clearly, Pakistan has this, and it starts with the registration of divorce or talaq, and then very strong rights of khula. Now, contrast this, and this would have happened in a month's time, or say 2 months' time, or whatever. But contrast this with a recent case I did in the Supreme Court. That's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. The couple had a child of the age of 21, and I asked them, how long have you been at it? Because Supreme Court judge had asked me to help them sort out their problem, and they said, we've been fighting for 20 years. I said, but your child is only 21, and he said, yeah, he was in my womb when we started fighting, and they hadn't got a divorce. So 20 years later, they get a divorce. So anybody who sits and pontificates about the inadequacies of the divorce system in Islam must also reflect on the inadequacies of having to fight to get divorced for 20 years. And that was lucky because I was sitting in court and the judge said, can you please take them out and try and settle it? And we managed to settle it. So they got a divorce in 20 years, might have gone for another 30 years, etc. But so these rights are there. The trouble with Islamic societies, I think, has been that many of these rights they have quietly forgotten about because they are inconvenient to the man's world. And therefore, if you go back to the roots and discover that these rights are all there, you validate the point that Justice Nariman made, that this is a shockingly modern system, right? But I'm sure that you all heard reports of what happened in India and the judgments and the legislation that is being proposed, but nobody would have highlighted this because, and it's not because they are prejudiced, it's also because they're ignorant and they don't know. And I must compliment you that repeatedly in the arguments, the judges were being told, but Pakistan doesn't have triple talaq. So at least there is something good about Pakistan that the Indian Supreme Court has told. And
I'll just add one little thing.
Maybe you should build on it.
Just one little. Last year, when you marry, you have a form which you fill out.
Talaq.
I mean the nikah nama. And you have to write, do you allow your wife the right to divorce? And most men, 90%, just strike it out.
Yeah.
But now a new law has been enacted where that is no longer there.
You can't strike that.
You can't strike it out.
Yeah.
She has the right.
Well, the Muslim Personal Law Board in India that had resisted for 20 years any interference in talaq has now authorized a talaq nama, and has indicated that it supports that talaq nama, in which there are two things available. One, the delegation of the right to talaq to the woman, one, and two, categorical commitment that there will be no triple talaq. So they've done this after triple talaq has been outlawed. And the third item that they are now willing to introduce in the talaq nama is also that the husband will not be free to take another wife. That's also a third element that they are now willing to introduce in the talaq nama. So this is reform coming from within. You've done it earlier, we're doing it now.
So we have to move on. There are lots of people.
Just one little point I'll add. I'm sorry for that. in the law now, a man cannot remarry the same woman. She has to marry somebody else,
No,
get
no,
a divorce.
that's a little troublesome.
Yeah.
That's a little troublesome. I'll tell you that. I'll tell
Okay,
you.
I'm sorry.
I'll come
That's
back.
okay, there's tea and coffee
No,
to
we
carry
come
on
back.
afterwards.
We'll come
Yes,
back.
go ahead.
I just thanks for the interesting talk, but I have a slightly separate question from debating. But I think there have been many casualties of this government as far as the Muslims of India are concerned. But one of the recent ones, which I think is most troubling, is the low representation of legislators who are from a Muslim background in Indian politics. And considering that we do not have any conversation around affirmative action for religious minorities when it comes to electoral representation, I was just really wondering what is the future of Muslim politics in India, because I find it a very troubling and dangerous scenario that there is absolutely no representation.
Yeah, good. That's a very good question. Ideally, in a good working democracy, we shouldn't have to worry about this. Every political party should, in its program, in its policy, in its ideology, and its functional outreach to the electorate, should automatically bring in people from different backgrounds and belonging to different religions, so that their outreach and their picture is attractive to the largest number of people. Unfortunately, this gets marred and this gets adulterated by some calculations where you think that let's do politics of us versus them, because on a calculation, us means more, and if we target them, more of us will come together. My confidence is that you cannot sustain that kind of calculation. You may do it in one election, you may do it after something has happened, but ultimately you have to reach out to the largest number of people if you want to be successful. So there are phases in our country where one kind of politics, say upper caste politics, has dominated, and then backward caste politics has dominated. Then in a sense, Dalit politics emerges from time to time, and then Dalit politics has played a very major role. Minority politics has come, and that's played a major role at one given time. But I think we have to get beyond this, and we will get beyond this, is my confidence. Whether it should be done explicitly, implicitly, quietly, diplomatically, it's a matter of political strategy. Because sometimes, by affirmative action, you get a reaction as well. Sometimes, by not giving affirmative action, you lose out because people lose hope in you and faith in you and trust in you. But that's a matter of strategy. I think if your mind and your heart is very clear about what you need to do, and your principles about what democracy truly is, if that is clear, I think the tactical moves that you need to make can be worked out.
There's a question.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
When for example, we used, the terms of Muslim politics, Hindu politics, and there is a fear of the fear of secularism being concocted. And on that point, I agree when you said that it is only a truly religious person that will understand secularism. Now, my question is, everything that we talk about today comes down to a political debate. Let it be from Oxford, Cambridge, or even the schools in India, there is nothing that we can say on either social media or on a public platform that will not have a political bearing. You will have to be very conscious. So now my question is to tackle this on the political level itself. There was a proposal for simultaneous elections being conducted throughout. The argument against this was a huge expense to the exchequer, and what happens if a state government falls. But then, don't you think that the campaigning for the next election begins on the day a government assumes office? So everything takes a political stance. We have to look at the electoral vote bank, and I mean, as a politician, as an MP, as a minister, What are your takes on this? On something that you can
Well,
shield?
frankly, there are advantages and severe disadvantages. You already mentioned the organizational and management issues that are involved, expense and so on. And then the constitutional issues are involved as well. What do you do with the government that falls? How do you fill the gap, etc. So a great deal of thought has to go into this before attempting something like this, which could end in chaos. But look at the other side. What do you get? See, you get a bad government, and the best people can elect the worst governments. You get a bad government, but at least there is a cooling period. Now you have the systems in our country, Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha. You get a clear majority in the Lok Sabha, but the Rajya Sabha holds you back for a while, or sort of retards your move in a particular direction for a while, till the assemblies start sending different kind of people to Rajya Sabha. So there's a gap of 2 or 3 years before it can be said that there's only one color in the whole country. And that may not be a bad thing entirely, because you don't always choose good governments. We say that people can never be wrong, etc., but people are wrong very often. And they're wrong not because they have an intrinsic weakness in themselves, but because their decision is influenced with a lot of things that may happen overnight. And a person who votes in one way today might vote differently 3 months later, because at that particular moment there are events that move him in a particular direction. I think it's happened in this country in Brexit. And everybody knows that if you had a Brexit referendum today, it might be quite different. And yet you're being pushed inevitably towards Brexit. So critically, I think we need to spend a lot of time talking about different possibilities, dimensions of the impact that it can have, and the fact that you could end up with a bad government. You know, the biggest danger of democracy is, and we should learn that from Hitler's experience, the biggest danger of democracy is when democracy goes wrong. If there is no democracy and there are people who are forcing themselves on the country, then there's an aspiration to fight for your freedom, and there is therefore a lack of legitimacy in your government, and you continue in hope that you will be able to get a legitimate government to replace them. But when you have a democratic decision that is bad, it's very difficult to say this is not a legitimate decision, because it's the majority view. And if that becomes dictatorial, or that turns perverse, then it's a very, very difficult thing. Of course, thankfully, 5 years, things change, new elections come, and you have a chance to take a fresh look.
Thank you, sir, for your talk. I wanted to connect to the point and the idea of India that you made, and also the idea of the Indian Muslim.